Hey guys, this is chapter 8 of Stuart Little. This one is called Margallo. So, let's get into it. Because he was so small, Stuart was often found he found Stuart was often hard to find around the house. His father and his mother and his brother George Sheldon could locate him by looking for him. Usually they had to call him, and the house often echoed with cries of "Stuart, Stuart," and would come into a room, and you might be curled up in a chair, but you wouldn't see him. Mr. Little was in constant fear of losing him and never finding him again. He never made him a tiny. He even made him a tiny cape, such as the hunters wear, so that he would be easier to see. One day, when he was 7 years old, Stuart was in the kitchen watching his mother make tapioca pudding. He was feeling hungry, and when Mrs. Little opened the door to the electric refrigerator to get something, Stuart slipped inside to see if he could find a piece of cheese. He supposed, of course, and his mother had seen him. And when the door swung shut, he realized he was locked in. It was surprising. It surprised him greatly. Hey guys, this is chapter 8 of Stuart Little. This one is called Margallo. So, let's get into it. Because he was so small, Stuart was often found Stuart was often hard to find around the house. His father and his mother and his brother George Sheldon could locate him by looking for him. Usually they had to call him, and the house often echoed with cries of "Stuart, Stuart," and would come into a room, and you might be curled up in a chair, but you wouldn't see him. Mr. Little was in constant fear of losing him and never finding him again. He never made him a tiny. He even made him a tiny cape, such as the hunters wear, so that he would be easier to see. One day, when he was 7 years old, Stuart was in the kitchen watching his mother make tapioca pudding. He was feeling hungry, and when Mrs. Little opened the door to the electric refrigerator to get something, Stuart slipped inside to see if he could find a piece of cheese. He supposed, of course, and his mother had seen him. And when the door swung shut, he realized he was locked in. It was surprising. It surprised him greatly. "Help!" he cried. "It's dark in here. It's cold in this refrigerator. Help! Let me out. I'm getting colder by the minute." But his voice was not strong enough to penetrate the thick wall. In the darkness, he stumbled and fell into a saucer pan of prunes. The juice was cold. Stuart shivered, and his teeth chattered together. He wasn't until half an hour later when Mrs. Little opened the door and found him standing on a butter plate, beating his arms together and trying to keep warm, and blowing on his mouth, and hoping to up and down. "Mercy!" she cried. "Stuart, my poor little boy." "How about a nip of brandy?" said Stuart. "I'm chilled to the bone." But his mother made him some hot broth instead, and put him to bed in his cigarette box with a doll's hot water against his feet. Even so, Stuart cried a bad cold, and this turned into bronchitis, and Stuart had to stay in bed for almost 2 weeks. During this illness, the other members of the family were extremely kind to Stuart. Mrs. Little played tic-tac-toe with him. George made him a soap bubble pipe and a bow and arrow. Mrs. Little made him a pair of ice skates and out of 2 paper clips. One afternoon, Mrs. Little was shaking her dust cloth out of the window when she noticed a small bird lying on the windowsill, apparently dead. She brought it and put it near the radiator, and in short while it fluttered its wings and opened its eyes, it was a pretty len-head bird, brown and with a streak of yellow on its breast. The Littles didn't agree on what kind of bird she was. She's a wall-eyed vireo, and said George scientifically. I think it's more like a young wren, said Mr. Little anyway. They fixed a plate for her in the living room and fed her and gave her a cup of water. Soon she felt much better and was hopping around the house, examining everything with the greatest care of interest. Presently, she hopped upstairs and into Stuart's room, where he was lying in bed. "Hello," said Stuart. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" "My name is Margallo," said the bird softly in the musical voice. "I come from the fields, once tall with wheat, from pastures in fern and thistle. I come from valleys and meadow sweets, and I love to whistle." Stuart sat bolt upright in bed. "Say that again," he said. "I can't," replied Mirago. "I have a sore throat." "So I have," said Stuart. "I've got bronchitis." "You better not get too near me. You might catch it." "I stay right here by the door," said Mirago. "You can use some of my gargle if you want to," said Stuart. And here are some nose drops, and I have plenty of Kleenex." "Thank you very much. You are very kind," replied the bird. "Did you take your temperature?" asked Stuart, who was beginning to be genuinely worried about his new friend's health. "No," said Mirago, "but I don't think it will be necessary." "Well, it's better to make sure," said Stuart, "because I would hate to have anything happen to you." "Oh, yes," Margallos replied. "I'm going to sleep in the Boston fern on the bookshelf in the living room. It's a nice place for my city location. And now, if you excuse me, I think I shall go to bed. I see it's getting dark outside. I always go to bed at sundown. Good night, sir." "Please don't call me sir," cried Stuart. "Call me Stuart." "Very well," said the bird. "Good night, Stuart." And she hopped off the light, bouncing steps. "Good morning, Margallos," called Stuart. "See you in the morning." Stuart settled back under his bedclothes again. "There's a mighty fine bird," he whispered, and sighed a tender sigh. When Mrs. Little came in later to tuck Stuart in for the night and hear his prayers, Stuart asked if she thought the bird would be quite safe sleeping down in the living room. "Quite safe, my dear," replied Mrs. Little. "What about that cat, Snowball?" asked Stuart sternly. "Snowball won't touch the bird," his mother said. "You'll go to sleep and forget all about it." Mrs. Little opened the window and turned out the lights. Stuart closed his eyes and laid there in the dark, but he couldn't seem to go to sleep. He tossed and turned, and the bedclothes got him rumpled. He kept thinking about the bird downstairs asleep in the fern, and he kept thinking the way Snowball's eyes gleamed. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, he switched on the lights. There's just something in me that doesn't trust the cat," I murmured. "I can't sleep knowing that Mirago is in danger." Pushing the covers back, Stuart climbed out of bed, and he put his wrapper and slippers, taking his bow and arrow and a flashlight. He tiptoed out into the hall. Everybody had gone to bed, and the house was dark. Stuart found this way to the stairs and descended slowly and cautiously into the living room, making no noise. His throat hurt him, and he felt a little bit dizzy. Sick as I am, he said to himself, got to be done. Being careful not to make a sound, he stole across to the lamp by the bookshelf, shined it up the cord, and climbed onto the bookshelf. There was a faint ray of light from the street lamp outside, and Stuart could dimly see Maralgo asleep in the fern, her head tucked under her wing. Sleep dwell upon thine eyes, peace in thy breast, he whispered, repeating a speech he had heard in the movies. Then he hid behind a candlestick and waited, listening for watch. For half an hour he saw nothing, heard nothing but the faint ruffle of Maralgo's wing when she stirred in her dreams. The clock struck 10 loudly, and before the sound of the last stroke had died, Stuart saw two gleaming yellow eyes peering out from behind the sofa. So, thought Stuart, I guess there's going to be something doing. After all, he reached for his bow and arrow. The eyes came nearer. Stuart was frightened, but he was a brave mouse, even when he had a sore throat. She placed an arrow against the cord of the bow and waited. Snowball crept softly towards the bookshelf and climbed noisily up into the chair within easy reach of the Boston fern where Maralgo was sleeping. When he crouched, ready to spring, his tail waved back and forth. His eyes gleamed bright. Stuart decided that time had come. He stepped out from behind the candlestick, knelt down, bent his bow, and took careful aim at Snowball's left ear, which was the nearest to him. This is the finest thing I've ever done, thought Stuart, and he shot an arrow straight into the cat's ear. Snowball squeaked in pain and jumped down and ran off towards the kitchen. A direct hit, said Stuart. Thank heaven. Well, there's a good night's work done. And he threw a kiss towards Maralgo's sleeping form. He was a tired little mouse and crawled into bed a few minutes later, tired but ready to sleep. First sleep at last.